Hi, thank you for tuning in to Noire Histoire. I'm Natasha, and today I'm going to be discussing King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild. King Leopold's Ghost is the story of how King Leopold of Belgium used violence and coercion to gain control of the Congo. But on a larger scale, it provides perspective on how various European powers carved up Africa for their own gain. The book includes a reasonable amount of data and statistics that show how Leopold profited from devastating the Congo. King Leopold's Ghost is a well-recommended and highly rated book. I understand the significance of the book and the events it gives attention to, but while the book is informative, I found it to be not exactly dry, but hard to get lost in. Usually when I'm really into a book, I use every spare moment to try to read another page or two. The story and characters draw you in, and you find yourself wanting more, wanting to know what's next. Hochschild includes a lot of insightful data in the book, but I found the main person in the story, Leopold, to be a pretty boring individual. He seemed like a rather miserable person who was completely absorbed with his own needs and wants. Learning about his schemes and machinations was interesting and necessary to understand how plans and initiatives were developed and executed. I'm usually drawn to people in the story, but in this case, most of the people involved just ran together, and I had a hard time keeping track of who was who. Part of this is a result of history being told by the victors. The first-hand accounts primarily came from Europeans and Americans active in Africa during this time. A more powerful book would have been if the story of Europe's pillage of Africa, in this case Leopold's plundering of the Congo, had been told from the perspective of the affected Africans that survived. Hochschild does his best to include these perspectives where possible, but part of the problem with colonialism is that in addition to forcibly confiscating land, goods, and other possessions, the occupying force also tends to stifle the voices of the colonized. So people aggrieved by colonization lose not only their lives and the way of life they've known, they also lose their personhood as the violations and wrongs committed against them are quietly tucked away. In some ways, this took away from King Leopold's Ghost, but it's indicative of the larger story at hand. What's largely missing from the book, a plethora of first-hand accounts about all of the events in the book, provides powerful commentary about what is in the book. Quite often, when we think of Africa, it's spoken of as though it's one large country. The reality is that it's comprised of 54 countries per the United Nations, yet the names and borders of these countries were heavily influenced by European colonization. Prior to the Europeans, the boundaries between villages, cities, etc. were different. Leopold's explorers ventured into the interior of the continent and named rivers, lakes, mountains, etc. to their liking, and quite often after themselves or their benefactors. They claimed land through exploitative trades and treaties, then implemented infrastructure that allowed for the cultivation of natural resources, goods, etc., and their transport to Europe and other markets, without paying for them or paying very little for them. At the epicenter of this particular story is rubber. In history classes, I'd learned of the rushes for gold, spices, and if you're in America, cotton. When you think of it, these situations have occurred at just about every point where some country or entity recognizes a market for a natural resource or good. Instead of paying fair market price for the resource and its associated labor, inhumanity is allowed to run rampant. The people who are intended to provide the forced or slave labor are first dehumanized. There's always some reason given for them needing the guiding hand of the more powerful party. In this case, Leopold and the Belgian overseers initially cloaked themselves in the idea of helping to civilize the collective now referred to as the Congolese. As part of their education, the Congolese men are made to work tirelessly, first as porters and other expedition support roles, then in the building of railroads, and finally as rubber sap gatherers. They did so under the threat of the lash and or threat of their families who were being held hostage, being maimed or murdered. Women were used as concubines and forced to perform other types of labor. Most frequently, hands and heads, but occasionally other body parts were cut off as punishment or as proof of kills in raids and conflicts. The brutality masquerading as an education in civility really just served as a conduit for unrestricted capitalism. King Leopold's Ghost made 2 points that really struck out to me. First, the 1800s saw the abolishment of slavery in many locations that played a role in the Atlantic slave trade, but the powers that either profited from the Atlantic slave trade and colonization in the New World or had missed the boat were looking for a similar but new emerging market. This leads to the second point. Many of the countries that now pat themselves on the back for becoming anti-slavery and abolishing slavery in the 1800s were involved in the carving up of Africa for colonization. Belgium is the primary focus of King Leopold's Ghost, but stories of France, Germany, Britain's, etc.'s exploits are also included. The countries that felt compelled to bring a civilizing hand to Africa also had no qualms about using those hands to pillage and murder in their colonies. And if you think about it, there's a tendency where countries make the case for themselves colonizing a nation or an area because they're, I guess, more civilized, or like they're morally superior to the people that are essentially their competitors. So they all have the same goal in mind, but they use this idea of their civility as the reason why they should be allowed to colonize a land versus, a competitive country. And so now, 100 or so years later, popular history glosses over these events and portrays these once colonizers as the modern standard bearers for human rights and, trying to bring about world peace or preserve world peace. I wholeheartedly recommend reading King Leopold's Ghost. It's not a perfect book, but even with the limited resources, it is a poignant book. The book isn't very long, but it's packed with a lot of information, and descriptions of some events are quite atrocious. King Leopold's Ghost isn't for everybody, but I think you'll find it interesting if you're okay with a book that moves pretty slowly, and the battles are wars of words and conniving schemes. There are descriptions of wars and conflicts, but not really two armies fighting each other, so don't expect any Hollywood theatrics. I've been trying to expand my knowledge and understanding of history across the Black diaspora. This is one of the first books I've read that covers what occurred in Africa after the peak of the Atlantic slave trade. It primarily focused on one country, the Congo, but I think it's a good starting point for diving into the history of African countries, as it also provides brief overviews of what was happening in other African countries at this time. I wouldn't say I enjoyed the book exactly. It was dry at points, but overall I'm glad that I read it and would recommend the book, as I learned a lot about individual historical figures and a particular time period in the history of the Congo. It made me want to learn more about this area of Africa, what it was like before it came to be known as the Congo, and what occurred since the death of Leopold. Thanks for listening and watching. I hope you return to get motivated, get inspired, and get stories of Black history made and in the making. Until then, take care. For more information about Noire Histoire, visit the Noire Histoire website. There you'll find text, video, and audio for each episode, all in one place. Subscribe to the Noire Histoire newsletter to get fresh content delivered straight to your email inbox. You can also subscribe to the Noire Histoire YouTube channel for videos. If you're enjoying the content but would prefer to listen to audio, you can subscribe to the Noire Histoire podcast. Follow Noire Histoire on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Enjoy the rest of your day.